Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Over-Communicate Clarity. Today, Strive consultants Ralph Kickert and Rishi Bhaskaran will discuss the most underestimated and often forgotten role of the leader. This is the third part of a four-part series based on the organizational health model that Pat Lencioni introduces in his latest bestseller, The Advantage.
Welcome to our webinar on Over-Communicate Clarity. And thanks for joining us. As we have shared before, organizational health is the greatest competitive advantage. And in that whole process of developing organizational health in your organization, one of the keys that we need to do is to over-communicate clarity. Mm-hmm. So let's just get right into it.
Absolutely. And much of what we're going to cover today is from Patrick Lencioni's best-selling book, The Advantage. And if you've read his book before or attended one of our previous webinars, you'd already be familiar with this. But what we'd like to say is to work towards organizational health, it's important to recognize that there's two requirements for success. And that's for all organizations. It doesn't matter what kind of company, a large multi-billion firm or a small business or even a church or a department within a company. There's two areas that you need to work on to maximize your success. And the first area you'll see on your screen is SMART. Now, that just basically means strategy, marketing, finance, technology, the stuff they teach at business school. It's the traditional decision sciences. And it's very important. It's absolutely critical. But what we're really excited is to talk to you about the second column, which is health. Now, again, we can't underestimate how important the SMART side of the business is, but the other area, the healthy side, gets largely ignored. And healthy has to deal with minimum politics and confusion, high degrees of morale and productivity, very low turnover amongst your best people. And I think we're getting to a place today where it's harder and harder to differentiate your company if you only focus on the SMART side.
Yeah, the health side is so critical.
It is.
And the challenge is for management and leaders is to just focus on that side in addition to the SMART.
In addition to, right.
And the tendency for many leaders is to focus on the SMART.
Yeah.
And we do have to do the SMART. We want to acknowledge that, just like you have said. Mm-hmm. The key, though, that we think is critical, and this is what Pat Lencioni talks more about, is making sure you also have the healthy.
Absolutely.
Because the healthy will also have a huge impact on enhancing the SMART.
Absolutely. The majority organizations out there, ones that are failing or maybe have previously failed, if you analyze them, you'll find that they're not dumb or unintelligent organizations,
not at all.
Right? They're extremely smart. Their challenge was primarily that they weren't healthy or they didn't have that healthy culture. So I think we would say to you today that really the greatest opportunity for meaningful improvement is on this healthy side.
Yeah. And, when you think of over-communicate clarity, so much of that comes right back to the healthy. Mm-hmm. We have a tendency not to want to over-communicate because people are smart, they're intellectual, and we don't have that desire to over-communicate. And that's why Pat talks about it also. It's not just to communicate clarity or communicate, it's about over-communicate. And that's what we're going to spend more and more time on today as we go through this webinar.
Absolutely. So let's start talking about the four disciplines. These are the disciplines that you need to work on in order to build a healthier organization. So the first discipline is to build a cohesive leadership team. And that just basically means that the team at the top needs to be behaviorally aligned.
Yeah.
That's when we're willing to hold each other accountable, willing to be vulnerable with one another, and really have good debate about good things.
Yeah, it's really trying to get that number one team or the leadership team to focus on collective results.
Collective results.
Focus on the purpose of the organization. Focus on what is right and not on themselves.
Absolutely.
And just like I think you said, is they build trust, they have conflict, and I think you're ready to say, next thing after that, they commit to each other and to the direction.
All right, now you have accountability. This is all great. So once we have that cohesive leadership team, discipline number 2 is to create organizational clarity.
Yeah. And the key thing when you look at organizational clarity, or, creating that clarity, is we got to answer 6 basic questions. That's what Pat would suggest. 6 questions that are critical for us to define, to articulate, so that we are all on the same page.
That's right.
That we're all setting the same direction. Critical questions that also provide tremendous, you could say, information to the rest of the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Because companies, they need to know what's most important. They need to know the answers to these 6 questions, not be left in the dark.
Yeah.
So that we're not confused as to where we're headed.
Yeah. And the more clarity, the less confusion, the less politics that we talked about in organizational health.
Absolutely.
So once we've got those 6 questions fully defined, and if you want to hear more about those 6 questions, just going to ask you to listen to our previous webinar on creating clarity. So don't be afraid to just go back to that one there. What we want to move to now, though, the third discipline is, so once we've got all that clarity, it's all about over-communicating that clarity. Not about communicating, it's over-communicating clarity.
Absolutely. And we're going to spend a lot more time talking about this in today's webinar, but it's about repeating those key messages. You know, we're in a culture today where if I've said it once, I've said it enough that you already know what I'm talking about. But it's important. If you're saying something important, then it's not redundant. Then it's not a waste of time.
Especially if we're passionate about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the team needs to know, the rest of the organization needs to know that we're passionate about it.
You bet. And we're going to talk, as Rishi said, a lot more about this. Fourth area, though, that we want to just, again, reinforce that is all about organizational health is to reinforce that clarity.
Right. And when we reinforce, we're really referring to the human systems.
Yes.
So when you hire, when you fire, when you promote, it's got to be based on those 6 critical questions. It's got to be based on the things that you've established as important to your company.
It's about, the culture, as you would say, Rishi. I think that's what we talk about is that culture that we want to reinforce. So it is, like you said, with the hiring and the firing.
Yeah.
It is also with how do we do the performance review? How do we reward? How do we do those kind of things to reinforce the culture that we are trying to create?
Right. There's a statement, I'm not sure who made it, but it's institutionalize our culture without bureaucratizing it. That's what we need to do by reinforcing.
Right on. Well, let's get into the core area that we were going to talk about today in this webinar, and that's about over-communicating clarity. And let's just talk a little bit about what it is first. And I think, my number one comment is that we have an expectation, Rishi, that we communicate once, twice, 3 times, and if we do it 3 times, boy, we are bending over backwards to communicate to our employees.
Right.
And that is so far from what we're trying to present and share with you is that when we over-communicate, this is time and time and time and time and time and time and time until you are just tired of hearing it from me.
Yeah, almost incredibly redundant.
Yeah.
See, the statement you made earlier, Ralph, I think leaders don't like to over-communicate because they think they're going to insult their audience.
That's right.
I've told you once, you're intelligent enough, you know what I'm talking about, let's move on.
Right.
But it's that funny statement, when you love your wife, you tell her over and over again that you love her. You don't just say it once and then, sweetheart, if anything changes, I'll let you know. Otherwise, just consider it the default statement.
How often do you say it? Many times.
And over and over.
Why do you think that it's so critical for people to hear it so often?
Right. Research says that things need to be mentioned at least 7 times before anything sticks. Now, I don't know about 7. I don't care if it's 70. It doesn't matter how many times. The point is, I would say it's a human tendency. We're just typically skeptical of things. We're unsure of what we're being told unless we've heard it over and over and over again.
And I'm going to suggest the reason why it's so critical is people need to not just hear it from you, they need to know that you believe it.
Yeah.
That is the core, is that you believe it, you're willing to die for it, you're willing to be passionate about this.
Right.
Don't give me something that you don't really believe. Then it's just words.
So let's dive further into this. The only way for people to embrace and internalize a message is when they hear it over and over and over again over a period of time. In fact, Pat came up with this expression called the chief reminding officer.
Instead of the CEO.
Why? Because what he's doing, what his responsibility is to remind the organization of this clarity, of this discipline too that we talked about. Yeah. Remind the team over and over and over again.
That's so good. If you think about, yourselves as you're listening to this, you say, oh, yeah, people talking about communication, and I don't always want to do that. Let me just remind you again. If you think of your organization, I can think of every organization we have worked with. Not one organization has said that we communicate enough.
Yes.
If I talk to employees, they typically say management doesn't communicate enough. If you talk to management, they typically say, yeah, we don't do a great job in communication. So it's really interesting that we somehow have this perception that we don't communicate well enough. And we also understand that that's something we just don't always want to do
Yeah.
for a variety of reasons. So we need to really focus on how do we over-communicate clarity.
Right.
And
Ralph, I've got a statistic about that I found. It's from Deloitte's 2010
Yeah.
Ethics and Workplace Survey. They said 48% of employees that plan to leave their current jobs want to leave the company due to a lack of trust. And a lack of trust is normally caused because of confusion, because they haven't over-communicated clarity. But get this, 46% of people say a lack of transparent communication from their organization's leadership is their main point of dissatisfaction.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
So as leaders, we've got a job. We all have a job to just keep working on this one. And I know that you're busy. I know that, life is throwing a lot of things at you. Let me just, again, help you to slow down and just recognize how critical this area is. Mm-hmm. Because as leaders, we need people to follow the direction, and therefore we got to spend the time doing what we need to do, and that is to communicate.
Right. And what's that statement that Samuel Johnson made? It's more important for people to be reminded of what they already know rather than be told what they don't.
Yeah. So what we're going to spend more time on this webinar on 4 key areas. Commitment clarification, we're going to talk a bit about that. Cascading and more some of the how. Top-down, and we'll get into that principle of top-down communication. And also, what about this lateral and upward communication? So those are the 4 areas that we're going to spend a bit of time. So let's just get right into, Rishi, commitment clarification.
Sure. And if you don't mind, let me paint a quick picture. I think many of us are busy. We have several meetings in a day. And maybe this is something that you can relate to, but I'll just give this example. You're going from meeting to meeting. You're in a meeting right now. The meeting started a little bit late, and you're stressed to finish the meeting quickly. And all of a sudden, you realize that your next one's coming up, so you just wrap up your points that you've discussed and just move on. Yeah. Nobody has really connected the dots or circled back to get to a place where we really know what we discussed at today's meeting. It just was a blur. Well,
we might have even have a perception of what we discussed, but we haven't got a joint one.
A joint one.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden now you've got a confusion. You've got gaps in between. I like what you said, Ralph. There's actually a perception that we've attained some level of clarity, but truly we're not on the same page.
Well, it's individual. I have mine. Someone else has another one. You may have a third, and we leave the meeting and we communicate. So now we perceive.
Right. So I tell my team something totally different than what you've told your direct reports. Yeah. That's causing disillusionment amongst the organization. It actually happens all the time in organizations.
You're so right. And I think you bring it up, and it's our busyness that gets in the way there.
Yes.
Sometimes we also, again, just want to think this is the dummying down of what we talked about. We're intellectual people around this table. Mm-hmm. We heard what everybody says. We heard what the CEO has said. Therefore, let's just go out and communicate this. Doesn't work so well.
When a leadership team stands side by side, shoulder to shoulder with one another, there can be no daylight that escapes between them. Right? They need to be so clear, so cohesive. This is what we talked about, that discipline 1. They need to be on that same page in such a way that when they go and disseminate these key details, key messages to the organization, there is no daylight in between them.
Yeah. So what we need is when we come to the end of a meeting, mm-hmm. or even in our discussions, what we need is commitment from everybody on that team to that direction. So if we have a decision to be made, nobody stays on the fence. Nobody's on the other side of the fence either. And everybody commits to the direction that we're setting.
Absolutely.
So that is number 1, is that there's a commitment to what we decided. And we may at the end of the meeting say, okay, let's spend 5 minutes just going over what did we agree, mm-hmm. and what are we going to communicate and what are we not going to communicate.
I think that's the key thing though, Ralph. What are we going to communicate and what are we not going to communicate? So these are areas that we discussed at today's meeting that are going to stay in this room. We're not ready to share it yet.
Yeah.
Right? And you said it before, Ralph, this is so basic, but this is absolutely an area that organizations have a hard time, a difficult time in, because they assume that they're already on the same page.
Yeah.
You just can't make these assumptions.
Assumptions are not going to be helpful because they're not going to get us to be cohesive. That's the big word I think that you said earlier. So again, commitment to the direction. Nobody's against the direction. And then we spend a few minutes saying, this is what we're going to communicate to who. Next area that we want to just talk a little bit about is well, how do we communicate that? How do we cast this information to the rest of the organization?
And here's the one statement I would make before we get into this. If you haven't gone through Discipline 1, which is to build a cohesive leadership team, and if you haven't gone through Discipline 2, where we've answered all these 6 critical questions and received a good sense of alignment around these things, then no amount of communication is going to be effective. So let's make sure that you've got clarity on both Discipline 1 and Discipline 2. And then now, from the leadership team, we need to disseminate these details throughout the organization.
Yeah. We need to also, so we need to present it in a way that makes sense. So I'm going to suggest it has to be somewhat simple.
Yeah.
We can't make it so complex. It's got to be organized. We need to have passion. We can't give them too much. Because when we give them too much, it just becomes a blur.
Everything you're saying, Ralph, I need to make this, I need to share a story. So as an organization I had worked with, and we did this pretty intense major all-hands meeting. And the purpose of that meeting was to share a new strategy with the entire organization. And they thought that it was important enough of a message that they created this elaborate meeting environment. We had food brought in. We even had a DJ to play music because they wanted to entertain us. We felt like herded cows walking into this meeting, not knowing why we were there. We had a dog and pony show with all kinds of slides on the presentation. And they even told us, this might be too much information right now. So if you need to go back, we'll make the slides available on the intranet. You can go back and get it. But we're already busy. We knew we were not going to go back and look at those slides. And, it was a common consensus at the end of the session. All of us were outside talking to one another. Hey, so what did you really mean by that statement? And what did they share about this? There was a confusion amongst us, the employees. We didn't really know why these messages were being shared with us and what we were supposed to do with this wealth of information that we've just been dumped on.
Yeah. It's got to be simple. It's got to be organized. And, the whole thing is we can say, well, we communicated something to the employees. The key for us as leaders is to say, okay, how do we communicate this so that they understand? We need to put ourselves in their shoes and say, okay, what information can we provide to them so that they can be more aligned with the direction of the organization, that they can continue to help us build the organization further. That's what it's about, is how do we give them information to help them in their workplace, help them in their, their desire for a meaningful contribution, and also help them to bring new ideas to the company.
Absolutely.
So again, it's not about me. It's about how do I help the employees, everybody in the organization, the stakeholders, the partners, to add value to our organization. And that's part of the that organizational health we talk about, and creating new innovative ways to do things better.
Yeah, and again, this is so basic. It's not overcomplicated, but most organizations out there make these same mistakes. They assume, I've already told them once.
Yeah.
They know what I'm talking about. What you talked about, this whole passion, to share that passion. Leaders need to give their staff, their employees, a reason to come to work.
You're right.
That they got to share that passion, that why, and it's got to be bigger than just themselves.
So I'm just building on that. So the communication has to be relevant.
Yes.
That's, I think, the word that you're getting into. What are the implications of why we're sharing this?
Yeah. Now I wake up in the morning, get out of bed, and I've got some sort of excitement for going to work.
Yeah.
Because you've told me that my work has meaning.
Yeah. Right. So again, where does this fit? See, again, the more clarity we can give to the employees, the more content they are going to do in their work, and the more work they're going to get done.
Right.
And that's what this is all about, is answering them the why and the purpose of their workplace and the implications to them.
And I've talked to leaders, they say, well, I don't know, this top-down communication, I don't know how much of it we can do. We've got a mission statement on the board. It already explains what it is that we do. They should have our culture from it.
It doesn't work that way. If I think back, and if I go back to the 60s or so, I think the communication style of the leaders was take the old baseball bat and just hit the ones that from behind, and they'll learn. They'll learn pretty quick of what's right and what's wrong, but we'll just go ahead and take the bat to them and make them work. And then I think of the 80s, and I think that the style of communication was, how do I manipulate you, Rishi, to do what I want?
Right.
I'm not going to give you all the information. I'm going to withhold it because I don't want you to know the whole truth, but how do I manipulate you to do what I want? And I'm going to suggest that the age that we're in today, with so much transparency, you can't get away with that anymore.
Right.
And now the whole focus is, let's get our clarity, Let's be authentic. It's not about me as a CEO or as a leader. It's about the cause of the organization. And we then have to be really clear in our clarity and then be fully authentic. None of this fake stuff, none of this manipulation, none of this threats, but just truthfully, this is the direction we want to go.
Right.
And bring the employees with you. They'd love to be part of an authentic team.
They need to be part of something bigger than themselves.
Yeah.
And you know what? The rest of the organization can spot out something that's not genuine.
Right. So if it's all about your ego, guess what?
Buddy.
You bet. You're going to have huge issues because the nonverbals that are going to come with you, what you're saying,
right,
are going to be so loud that the employees are going to say, okay,
so you know,
here he goes again.
Absolutely. What you're going to start is you're going to create a culture of distraction, of confusion. There's going to be no clear direction. People are in the dark. This is what they say. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing.
You know, Rishi, I think that most CEOs, many CEOs, have a bigger ego than they think. You know, I don't know what to do with that. We all seem to, it comes out of our self-worth. But the key is, you know, they're there to serve the organization.
That's right.
And that's their focus, that's for sure.
Now, in Cascading Communication, let's talk about different methods of how to communicate this. We believe that when it's something critical, something serious, it shouldn't be done. It shouldn't be communicated via email or a newsletter or something informal like that. It needs to be personal.
Yeah.
I would actually say one step further, it needs to be in person.
You know, the more critical, the more implications of a decision or a direction, the more important it is to have it face to face.
Yeah.
And the less critical, the less impacting, the less, influence it has, then it can go to a lower form, like an email or like a form document. But it's critical for us to understand, you know, so what is the implication to the organization, to the staff, and then determine the type or the mode of communication. Because I think that we need to understand that also has huge implications when it comes to over-communicating clarity.
Absolutely. So let's talk about our next area of focus today, which is top-down communication. You know, communication is the lifeblood of any organization. Winning organizations always have a culture of communication. And without it, we talked about this, team members are going to be disillusioned. They're going to be detached, insecure. People want to know what's going on and why.
Yeah. And it's really, you know, when it says who's responsible for the communication in this organization, it's not the frontline staff. It's the leadership.
That's right.
And so often we just don't want to own that one. We want to put it into the middle management. We will put it into other places. But really, it's the top leaders that are responsible for how well are we creating the culture in the organization? Right. How well are we communicating throughout the organization?
Yeah, and that leadership, they got to repeatedly share that dream, share that vision, share that purpose, the why, the business definition, the culture, the values, our goals, what's most important. It's got to be communicated over and over and over again.
Yeah. And again, I think we have some challenges, just like we talked about in the introduction here on this one here, is that we as leaders want to do the thinking. We want to go and set the direction. Yeah. We seem to have fun and say that's our responsibility is to set the direction for the organization. And we almost kind of say, well, the communication, well, that's for the human resource people to do. Or, you know, I'm not so good at that. I'm a good thinker.
Yeah.
So I can just kind of put that to the side or I just don't do it.
Well, see, this is the one part of it, you're expecting somebody else to communicate on your behalf, which you should be the chief reminding officer, as we talked about before. Number two is you're just not doing it at all. I had an arrogant leader once tell me, we don't need to let those little people know what's going on. They don't need that information. They can't relate anyway.
Huge challenge.
Boy, if you can't trust them with that kind of content, that kind of information, you're not going to allow them to get into or become part of your vision.
Yeah.
Welcome them into your dreams.
So number one, that's your responsibility to communicate. And we're saying top down. And when we say top down, we expect you to set that direction for the organization. We expect you to answer those 6 questions. We expect you to set that culture.
Yeah.
And then, as you said so often, Rishi, is that cohesively, that leadership team communicates the same message throughout the organization. So the employees know really clearly the direction we're going.
Absolutely.
The expectations that management and leadership have of us. you just name it. They just know it because it's so communicated so clearly and succinctly.
And that doesn't mean having elaborate intranet sites. You know, we talked about that session where they said that the slides would be available after the meeting. It doesn't even mean elaborate newsletters and things that you send out. Just because you have some sort of publication going out on a monthly basis does not mean you've communicated with your team.
Right. You're so right. You know, it's also, if you don't do it, I'm going to suggest somebody else is going to make up the communication. They will.
Yes,
the rumor mill will work. The middle management are going to start to say, well, this is what I think the leadership is wanting. The employees are going to guess, and we're going to have all kinds of communication in the organization, no doubt. It just won't be the right communication.
You're talking about rumors. Gossip is one of the biggest problems that organizations have today. And the reason why you're leaving room for gossip is because there's this area of darkness.
The vacuum.
That's right. There's no clarity. And, gossip is unfair to everyone. It's unfair to the gossipers because all of a sudden they have this information they got to deal with no hope of resolution.
Well, they're trying to perceive what the truth is.
Right.
Or the direction is.
And then it's unfair to us as leaders of the organization because I don't have an opportunity to clarify. I don't have an opportunity to point them in the right direction. Let's just not go there.
It's interesting, Rishi, as we talk about gossip or the rumor mill, and some leaders use that rumor mill to communicate. Interesting, eh? Mm-hmm. Instead of just saying, okay, let's communicate clearly, they use that rumor mill as a form of communication.
Positive rumors about your organization.
Again, we don't really encourage that. We encourage, if it's going to be reinforcing it, we're pretty good with that. But it's about, hey, we haven't done our job if the rumor mill is doing all the communication for us.
That's right. So we may be saying this over and over again, but I think you're getting the impact of it, that it's important to over-communicate, the importance of over-communicating.
I think we're over-communicating.
Right. But when we let our organizations know that they're part of something bigger, when we say that over and over again, it gives people creativity, gives people energy for doing what they do. And then here's the funny thing. It also lets the occasional prima donna, that the guy that doesn't really know that he wants to be part of this, it lets them know that this company is going to succeed if he doesn't pull into the culture.
Yeah. Rishi, it reminds me, of my family. I would say to my children, I love you so often. And then I would go to them and say, guess what? And they say, Dad, I know it. And I said, what? Well, that you love me. And they kind of look at me and say, oh, Dad, you're bugging me. Mm-hmm. I think it was wonderful because they got that reassurance of what I believed. Mm-hmm. The same thing with employees. If they are saying to you, you've said this to me, 1,000 times, consider that a compliment.
Yes.
Consider that a compliment that you are doing your job, because that is critical, that they need to keep hearing it and your passion. And if they're saying you communicated this 100 times, say thank you.
Yeah. If you're not sick and tired of saying something over and over again, there's a chance that you're probably not communicated enough. Now, if we talk about teams, we all understand the importance of teams. Teams by definition are not even teams if they don't have a shared purpose, if they don't have a shared goal or a shared direction. And the only way that people can combine or get together on a combined goal or on a combined purpose is if it's been communicated to them. Mm-hmm. Now it's intentional, quality, consistent communication.
Yeah. All right, let's move to the lateral and upward communication in our fourth area. And let's just talk a little bit about those, two areas, lateral and upward. So first, let's go to lateral. What's critical is that the communication being top down is clear. And then the two different departments or the 5 different departments communicate again within that context of the top down. Mm-hmm. That it's not one department saying, this is what I'm doing, another department saying, this is what I'm doing. Instead, it's saying, okay, this is the direction that the leadership team is providing. Let's talk about how we go ahead and implement this.
Right. So in upward communication, it's extremely important to provide employees an opportunity to communicate upward.
You bet.
They need to share feedback. Now, understanding that the leader still makes the decision at the end, this is not a democracy. One of the most common complaints in unhealthy organizations is the breakdown of communication across departments and their inability to provide feedback upward.
let's just make it really clear. Communication has to go upwards because there's a lot of the new ideas, the innovations, suggestions are not only in the leadership team.
Right.
And we need to understand that if we share the direction we're going, my expectation is that you're going to come up with the rest of employees with all kinds of ideas of how to do this.
That's right.
How to implement this, or even, some of the direction we're setting. Well, the implications of this aren't so good. So we can't implement it very well.
Right.
So let's do some readjustments. And we need tons of communication upwards.
Secure leaders will recognize that now that I've shared my dreams and my passions, and I've got my team that have also jumped on board, they're energized, they're creative,
Correct.
they're ready to go, and they're going to come up with ideas that I want to embrace and welcome.
And that's why we need that transparency. Again, it's not about me. It's about the cause of the organization. So we're going to take the ideas, the wisdom of the workforce and the stakeholders and the partners. And the whole thinking of being healthy is to incorporate that into the organization.
Absolutely.
And therefore, we got to have the upward communication. And then we got to take that information and then synthesize it and then send it back down.
And when other members see that there was this team member that actually shared positive feedback and it actually was embraced and the company acknowledged it, leadership acknowledged it and actually did something about it, well, it starts to take away disillusionment. It starts to other staff that maybe hadn't jumped into the culture or bought in yet, when they watch this from the sidelines, it makes an impact to them.
So I don't want to just welcome upward communication. I'm going to go a step further. I'm going to expect all our employees to communicate upwards. Whenever something we have set as a direction as a leaders does not fit, does not work, my expectation, you can't use that as an excuse.
Right.
You have an obligation to communicate upwards the problems with it.
Correct.
And the challenges with it. And that's because I want you to be not just informed, but engaged in the direction of the organization with us.
Well, this has been great, Ralph. Let's circle back and talk about how this applies to this whole healthy, the smart and healthy that we referred to before.
Yeah. Well, let's just take, again, those 5 key areas of healthy. So the first one is minimal politics.
Right.
If we over-communicate, what will happen is that everybody's going to have such a good understanding of the direction. And then if one employee starts to play politics, all of a sudden the other employee is going to have a wealth of information and a wealth of understanding about the organization and is going to kind of say it doesn't work.
That's right.
Politics doesn't work because I have information. You can't use certain information against me or, in any other form.
Right. And then the last statement we talked about just before was when I have an avenue to share feedback, when I have an opportunity to have that open dialogue, there's that trust with the leadership.
Yeah.
When there's trust established, again, you're going to break down politics.
Yeah. And it's not about me as a leader. It's not about the employee that's on the front line. It's about the cause of the organization and the direction that we're all rowing in together. So there is no need for the politics.
Right.
So all that we do is we over-communicate, we reduce politics in the organization. The second one is all about confusion.
Well, it's very clear. If you communicate and over-communicate and tell me what the direction of the organization is, then I'm not in darkness anymore. I'm not confused.
And employees love that.
Yes.
Employees like clarity. We all want clarity.
Yeah. Employees want to know that they're important.
Yes.
And when you bring them in on these key messages, you're telling them that you're equally important. You're an equal part of this team. I don't want you in the darkness. I want you here in the light.
Which reinforces the third one, high morale. That's what we want. And if we over-communicate, what we do is we're saying to them, you're valuable to our organization because we're going to give you information to help you do your job.
Right.
You're going to say, hey, they value me.
Right. And now I buy into your dream. I buy into your vision. I buy into your core purpose. All of a sudden, I'm energized. I'm excited about why I come into work every day. And that's transparent. The rest of the staff sees it. That creates this wonderful morale.
I think there's such a strong link between over-communication and high morale.
Yeah.
Because it's all about when you over-communicate to me, you are saying to me, I matter, and that you respect me, etc. and I'm important and I'm adding value. And all of a sudden we say, okay, that just fits so much with who I am.
Right.
And that creates that high morale.
I have an example I have to share. I have a local telecommunications company that I've done some work with. And one of the biggest challenges as leadership shares right now is they have a trouble with morale, and they have a problem with morale. But yet when I talk to the staff and the team, their biggest problem is they're in the dark. They don't know what the company strategy is. They don't really know what the company's new direction is. And it's just out there plain and open. If you just communicate your vision, you could probably help fix this morale issue.
So right. Fourth one that we talk about in healthy is high productivity, or over communication having a tremendous impact on productivity. It makes so much sense. If you provide tons of clarity of direction, give us clarity on where we're needing to go throughout the organization, what we're going to have is less confusion, no doubt, and we're going to be more focused on our work.
Right.
That's going to create enhanced results, which is really going to go right down to the bottom line. Fifth one, low turnover.
Yeah. And this comes back down to, that high morale, that trust factor, that accountability, that I'm jumping in and connected with the vision and the dream of the organization, of the leadership. You're not going to lose your best people if you treat them as important individuals in the organization.
Well, that's the saddest part, eh? We don't lose the average or below average employees. We lose a lot of times the star employees.
That's right.
The ones that have the greatest impact on the organization. And that's why we want to over-communicate clarity.
Yeah, people need to know that what they do matters.
You bet.
And if you don't communicate that with them, if you don't let them feel that, then they're going to find another organization to work for so that what they do there matters.
Yeah. In conclusion, let me just share with you a few of the key summary points that I just want to emphasize again. One is, let's recognize as leaders that, a lot of times we're about the thinking and the strategy, and those are good things. Let's not, as I tend to do sometimes, forget about, our job is to remind people. Our job is to communicate the direction, not just to come up with the great ideas, but to say, okay, now how do we implement these? How do we communicate this? And that is a critical and almost sometimes unnatural role. And that we are it's our responsibility as leaders to do that communication and to make sure that the whole organization understands that. And that we are doing our utmost to not just say things once, but many, many, many times, reminding and reminding and reminding. As long as we own that the communication is ours, I think we'll go a long ways.
Absolutely. And I would say, secure leaders, healthy leaders, pass on a legacy of their company. They share stories of how they got to where they got to, they struggles and victories of how they incorporated or stuck to their strategic anchors and their values to accomplish this major task or to win this great client. You need to make these stories and communicating these stories part of your culture so that you can tell people this is how we got here and this is what we're all about.
Yeah. So thank you for joining us. Encourage you to over-communicate, and over-communicate so that your employees come back to you and others around you saying, I've heard this, and then take it as a compliment.
This has been part 3 of our 4-part series on organizational clarity. The final installment will be aired on October 3rd at 12 noon EDT. To listen to this webinar again or share it with a friend, go to www.strive.com and visit our resource section. If you want to get connected to more of what you heard today, call us at 519-766-9033. It is our aim to continue to provide fresh resources to help leaders lead.